Welcome back, everyone. This is the last plenary session for today. I hope you've had a good little break and ready to get back into the conversation. I hope that you've enjoyed the topic so far on all the different panels. And this session is finding solutions for refugees on TPVs and SHEVs. Refugees on temporary protection visas and safe haven enterprise visas have been in Australia for the last 8 years, but remain on indefinite temporary visas. The SHEV visa, or the Safe Haven Enterprise visa, was created to incentivize refugees to take up labour shortages in regional areas, but has failed to do so because of its complicated and unrealistic pathway to permanency. The panel will look at the proposals from the community to reform SHEVs and TPVs to create realistic pathways to permanency for this group of people and help them settle successfully in the Australian community. I'd like to introduce the facilitator for the panel, Asha Hirsch. Asha is a Senior Policy Officer with the Refugee Council of Australia, the national peak body for refugees and the organisations and individuals who support them. His work involves research, policy development and advocacy on national and international issues impacting refugee communities. Asha is also a PhD candidate and lecturer at Monash University in Public Law, Human Rights and Refugee Law. Asha will introduce the other two panelists and I'll be back with you to wrap up the day. So this is our last panel that will take us to the end of the sessions today. So enjoy. Thank you. Over to you, Asha.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us in the last session for today, and glad that you stuck around for this, hopefully an interesting and challenging debate and discussion about how to reform the current situation for refugees on temporary visas. In 2014, the coalition government was desperately trying to reintroduce temporary protection visas, which were initially introduced under Prime Minister Howard. However, it had to negotiate with a number of independent crossbenchers, including Clive Palmer, who was eager to encourage Labor into regional Queensland. One of the deals struck with the crossbench was to introduce safe haven enterprise visas alongside the TPV. While TPVs last for 3 years, the SHEV lasts for 5 years and was introduced and was intended to encourage refugees to meet labour shortages in regional areas. If a refugee on a SHEV works for 3.5 years in a regional area, they are then eligible to apply for another skilled student or partner visa, most of which are other temporary visas. This would then put them on a pathway to a permanent visa and eventually citizenship. But that pathway would take many years and require an exceptional ability to navigate a complex visa system, skill and language requirements, qualification, business sponsorship, and other visa criteria. Most refugees on the SHEV are not able to meet these requirements. And the government knew that and still knows this and knows that the pathway was unrealistic to meet. Today, only about 1/3 of refugees on a SHEV are living in a regional area, and most will not be able to receive another skilled visa after their 5 years. This has left people in indefinite limbo, unable to move forward, to settle in Australia and to reunite with their family. There are currently over 17,000 refugees on TPVs and SHEVs, and a further 4,000 waiting for an outcome on their application for a SHEV or TPV. While Howard did introduce TPVs, he also under Howard, many were eventually offered a permanent visa and allowed to settle in Australia with their family. The Howard government quietly moved many refugees from TPVs to permanent visas, and the Morrison government today could do the same thing. At the Refugee Council, we've been quietly advocating for concessions to the SHEV pathway to enable more people to access a realistic pathway to permanency. While we oppose the policy of TPVs and SHEVs outright, we also have to work with the current government to achieve whatever concessions we can to improve the lives of people today. As TPVs and SHEVs are likely to remain in place under this government, we believe there are areas that can be reformed to bring the policy more in line with the current situation of Australia today. With borders closed due to COVID-19, regional Australia has seen significant labour shortages, especially in the agricultural sector. We have been proposing that some SHEV holders can address these shortages in exchange for a permanent visa. A win-win-win for farmers, for the Australian community and for refugees. Our surveys and consultations with refugee communities show that refugees on SHEVs and TPVs overwhelmingly support these proposals. Likewise, we have seen interest from the current Minister for Immigration, Alex Hawke, to extend visas and recognise the situation for people from Myanmar. This could be emulated for other refugee groups, and a permanent visa offered for those who can demonstrate that a return to their home is impossible. Today, we are joined by 3 experts to discuss the solutions for refugees on temporary visas. Salem Askari, Ali Reza Unespo, and Professor Marianne Kenny. After brief introductions from me, I'll invite our speakers to talk about the issue of TPVs and SHEVs and their proposals for reform. We'll start with Salem Askari. Salem is a Hazara refugee from Afghanistan. He is currently on a 5-year SHEV visa after arriving in 2013 in Australia. He studies at TAFE and works part-time as a research assistant at the Centre for Human Rights and Education at Curtin University. He has collaborated with many different organisations across the country to advocate and bring policy change to the end of precarity for many people who live under TPVs and SHEVs. He also hosts a monthly meeting for people with lived experience to involve them, hear directly from them, and support them to be involved in the decisions about their lives. I'll also introduce our other 2 speakers. Ali Reza Unespo. Ali Reza works as an academic internship coordinator and acting director of the Work Integrated Learning in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, Australia. His PhD thesis examines the political economy of Afghanistan's higher education, and his research interests are in education politics in fragile contexts and asylum seeking refugee issues in Australia. He has extensive community development experience in conflict societies and has helped around 8,000 students in 22 rural schools in Afghanistan through his volunteer work with the Indigo Foundation Australia. His works have been published on Australian refugee issues and Afghan politics and higher education. Previously, Ali Reza worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, and as a lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. He was also a People of Australia ambassador with the Australian Multicultural Council from 2012 to 2013, during which he advocated for social cohesion and community harmony in Australia. And Professor Marianne Kenny. Marianne Kenny is an associate professor at Murdoch University Law School. She teaches researchers in the area of human rights and refugee law and is a legal practitioner. Marianne has provided independent advice on asylum seeker policy and detention to governments of Australia and Nauru. Previously, she was the director of the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University and held the position of chair of the Law Reform Commission of Western Australia. And thank you to our speakers today. I'm going to start with Salem, who is going to give a background of the SHEV policy and how it has affected his life.
Just to make sure everybody hear me.
Yes, you're good, Salem. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys, for giving me the opportunity to share my story and also discuss a little bit about the impact of SHEV, especially people who are in all community, and especially I'm mainly talking about the people who are coming from Afghanistan, because that's the country where I've come from. So before I start, I would like to also acknowledge to the traditional owner of the land, which I am currently sitting on, the Whadjuk people of Noongar Nation. And I pay my respect to the elders of past, present, and emerging. Asha, as you mentioned, that I am currently working as a research assistant in the Curtin University with Caroline Play and also Marianne Kenny, Lisa Hartley, in order to facilitate or to bring some policy change with in regards to the people living a precarious life for the last 8 to 10 years now. It has been a tough journey so far. We haven't had many sort of achievement. But the fact is that if you don't do it, then I mean, at the end of the day, you wouldn't even know if it's going to work or not. But at least the fact that we need to try and work together, if you could at least pull together something, that even a smallest thing that need to be discussed or need to be, even as small as a raising awareness into the community, because at the end of the day, I think it is much more vital for the community member to understand the impact of this sort of visa in the community, and instead of just going to the politician for asking that this is going to happen or this is the problems. Because if the community comes on board with you, then there's a highly likely chance that we can raise this issue in a much broader aspect or in a much powerful way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the SHEV, which I am currently having. It's a 5-year visa. It's a temporary visa, and it has a very slim prospect of getting permanency if you meet the requirements. But the requirements are really difficult and it's hard, and it's almost impossible for some of the people, because first of all, you need to do, for example, you need to meet the requirements of 3.5 years of working or studying in regional areas. In the meantime, you do not have to have any sort of support from Centrelink, and you have to be employed, and you do not receive any financial support in case you do not get the job. And therefore, there are a lot of worry, or for example, the stressed people going through this sort of, thought that if I leave, for example, the job that I have currently now, and to go to the regional area in order to meet the requirements, then what if I don't get the job? So there's no what if I go and lose my job in the middle of my pathway, and then I becomes on the Centrelink, then that's going to disqualify me. So these are the issue, one of the issues. And also, for example, there's the issue of exploitations, and then the issue of physical disabilities. For example, some people doesn't have the ability to work in a hard labor, for example, in the farming, which is mostly in the regional areas. And some people like having severe sort of disease and illness that they basically are not able to go to regional areas. So therefore, and there's no exception in the policy that, for example, say that if you have a certain sort of disability, you are, it doesn't matter, you have to stay where you are. It doesn't say that. So therefore, it is really difficult to put everybody in the same situation. And also, for example, from a mental point of view, I think it is extremely, and it is painful for the people who have been living and working for the last 10 years and established a life basically from zero, and now all of a sudden you have to tell them that you have to leave whatever you have made in wherever you are, whether it is city or regional areas, then you have to go to somewhere else in order to meet the pathways. And not only that, even if you, for example, even if you meet the requirements after 3.5 years, the next level of requirements for that visa, which is usually in skilled visa, is way too difficult for I can easily say that for 90% of the people in my community where I have come from, it is almost impossible. There's the level of the English requirements is too high. It's 6.5 or 6 band IELTS. It is a university level, and I'm struggling to get it. And you just imagine for a person who've come here as a dad, or who are illiterate in their own language, and then you ask them to provide a 6 band IELTS in order to be able to apply for a permanent skilled visa. And also there's an age limit that you have to be under age of 45 at the time of the application, which is another sort of discriminatory policy, because imagine somebody who has come at the age of 35 10 years ago, which is 35. I'm about to hit 35. I don't call myself an old person. So for the next 10 years I wouldn't be allowed to apply for that visa, because apparently I'm be redundant in the workforce, which is sad, because most of the people are probably not being able to meet this age limit criteria. And also the fact that the psychological damage that it is going to do for this people, for this cohort of people that living on a temporary visas. And when you tell them that you have to, for example, some of the people that I know that they ask about this sort of requirements, when I explain to them, it is simply disheartening, that you have to do all these age limits and English, and for example, you have to have certain sort of income, and you have to have the sponsorship at the end of that. And it is basically impossible, because some of them, they have been doing pretty well in terms of the businesses. Some of them have made businesses, and some of them, doing this sort of self-employed. They are tradies that doesn't have a boss, for example, at the end of the day to sponsor them. So they are self-employed, and now they are not going to be qualified for any sort of visa, because all the skilled visa does need, for example, do need all of them, that you have to have a sponsor from somebody, from your employer or someone. And now there's a whole heap of mess. It is a mess, and it doesn't solve the problem. It has not been thought through to make these policies. And now, even now, after 5 years, that we have seen some people who have even been living in regional areas like Adelaide and Canberra, and they are still struggling to get it, because apparently some of them has been either self-employed, or some of them now, for example, may be over the age of 45, and almost, I can say 90% of them doesn't have the level of the English language skills. So therefore, the amount of the psychological impact of these issues is enormous. And on top of that, you then have another sort of the situation that the country that they have come from. For example, in my own case, I have come from a country now that they are being in a war torn, which is like 2000, prior 2001. It is basically it's a mess, and everyone and the terrorists are getting closer and closer, and people have lost everybody is trying to run away if they can. And now, and then there's explosion, there are bombs, and then it's basically people living back home on a day-to-day basis. So there's basically no hope for them that they're going to be another day, unless something happens. Every day they go to work, they do not know whether they come back safe. So you just imagine all of them put together, and then put them in one person's that living in a temporary visa in Australia, and they have all of their family back in Kabul, Ghazni, or Jowhari, wherever they are. And you just put yourself in their shoes for 1 second, for one moment, and then imagine how you would feel instead of them. The amount of pain that you go through, for example, you cannot travel because you're not a permanent resident and it doesn't apply to you. You cannot get assistance from the government because you're a temporary visa, and you cannot sponsor your wife and your kid because you've come here 10 years ago, for example, by birth. And now your family is literally getting killed in front of your eyes, and you cannot do anything. And on top of that, there's another level of sort of insecurity. This compound precarity that you are experiencing on day-to-day basis, and that's what we need to discuss. And it's difficult for these people, apart from whether it is skilled or whether he speaks English or not. I think there's really a moral obligation for us. I'm not going to call to the government, for us as a responsible human beings, a community member, to raise our voice and to go and do what we can to talk to the MPs and to politicians to do something in their cases. It is extremely difficult for these people. And the exploitation that I have mentioned before it's huge. I have experienced it myself, and also, and I'm sure that everybody does in one way or the other. For example, one of them is, for example, the wage theft. Most of these people living in this current visa, because of this uncertainty that they are in, they do not have this confidence, for example, to go and ask the employer that you have to pay my wages on time, otherwise I'm not going to work it. Because the fact that they do not have the support, or do not feel the confidence to go and ask them, because they say that I am fearing the fact that if I go and talk to them about my age, I may be able to lose my job, and I wouldn't be able to get another job because of the temporary nature of my visa. Because everybody needs to have, every employer that you go, they prefer a permanent visa to be working for them instead of a temporary visa. And also the bad working conditions, the lower rate, and especially the bad working conditions is now killing people. And I have been a victim of one of them. I have been working as a stonemason, and I've been inhaling dust, and I've been exposed to silica dust and stuff. Even though I knew that it's going to damage my health, even though I knew it's going to be killing me one day, but I just kept, like, I have to stay there, because this is the only skill that I have, that if I am going to be able to apply for any of these visa, if Perth become a SHEV region, this is the stonemasonry. So I have to stick to this job to get my visa. And I stuck to this job to a point that one of my friends got contracted silicosis. And that's when the alarms went off for me that I have to leave it. It's not worth to risk my health. And now, even though I have left, but there are a lot of people who knowingly, they know that it's going to be difficult for them, but they just hope that, Perth become a SHEV region and they can apply for permanency. They do not even know the fact that they have to apply for, they have to meet a whole range of other requirements that they simply cannot do that. And these are the things that we need to address, that these are not simple things, it's huge. And one last thing that I need to mention before I'm conscious of the time, it is the term safety. Whenever, for example, we talk to the public or any gatherings in the community, always after when I finish my talk, and then people comes to me that say that, like, oh, Salim, thanks God that you are safe in here. And it is so, people see a different safe. I mean, I define safety in a different way than people who lives as Australian citizen, for example, who have their family with them. I define safety not as simply as being safe physically, for example, that I am safe, nobody is going to kill me. I define safety as something that I need to feel safe. In order to feel safe, you need to have the mentality, that you need to be able to think, you need to be able to be free, you need to be able to express yourself in a way that you want to. You need to move, you need to have the movement, the freedom of movement. And you need to have in the moment that you can enjoy with a cup of coffee with your family, with your friends, or with your wife, or with your kids. That is safety to me, not the fact that I am sitting lonely in a room, waiting for somebody to not kill me. I do not call that safety at all. That's a mental torture. If I had to choose that, I would have gone to a cave. I would have gone to a jungle. That's much safer than sitting in here. But the fact is that I am not belong to a cage. I am not belong to a jungle. I am not belong to a cave. I'm a human being. I do need that human touch. I do need to be loved with my the wife or the kids that I have, for example, or any other one that has a kid. You do need all of that in order to be safe. So that's why when anyone that argue that you are safe in here, it means that, like, you're putting, an analogy that I should say that it'd be like keeping the endangered bird into a cage and say that, oh, it's safe for them. But there are also other ways. You can't keep an endangered bird without putting it into the cage. There's a lot of other way of treatment that you can do that. So that's why it is extremely important for us all to argue or to engage in a conversation that is deep and that is on the human value, and also on the basis of their human nature. As a human nature, it is not only about the physical, it's also about the emotional connection. It's also about the trust, about the love, about the connection of the family. And it's very important that we need to take that into consideration while looking into the policies. And that's it. Thank you very much for the time. I think I've gone a bit over time.
Thank you very much, Salem. That was a very moving description of the policy and really how it is breaking people. And you've clearly explained the problems with it, as well as some personal experience with the requirements there. And I'm very sorry to hear about the situation that you and others are going through because of this government policy. I'd like to introduce Ali Reza next to talk about some of the work that he has been doing with some members of the Hazara community in trying to advocate for change to this policy. Ali Reza, thank you.
Thank you, Asher, and thanks for the kind introduction. I'm honored and pleased to be part of today's panel, the last session, and I also thank everyone who are with us in the session. It's really encouraging to see so many people at the conference today. I would like to start my presentation with an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land from which we have joined today. And I would like to talk about really three things. One is, of course, the complexity of solutions for the TPV and SHEV visas. Second, I would like to in the follow-up to Salem's presentation, which was heartening and very encouraging for Salem to share his experience, I would emphasize another group of people who are on bridging visas and on those who are without any visa in the community. If you have heard Salem's presentation, how tough and difficult it has been for SHEV and TPV holders, there's a smaller group within the community, about 4,000 people who are doing tougher than Salem. And I'd like to highlight that in my presentation. And then, of course, I would like to follow on the three solutions, or at least practical work that myself and a group of associations from the Hazara community have been working with the government, particularly since last year, which we believe are some of the potential pathways while we're in the current situation. Let me start with the complexity of the solution. We've heard that the SHEV and TPVs have been in place for 8 years. No one probably in Australia could have imagined that when the TPVs were introduced in 2013, that after 4 prime ministers, we still would be where we are. It has taken us 4 prime ministers, change of government after government, and unfortunately no progress has been made in this area of policy. It speaks volume. And I think why it speaks volume is because we have missed opportunities in every previous elections that we had the chance to say to our government that we are tired of this, that it is enough. And from my perspective, it is no longer about the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. It is hurting Australia's social cohesion. It is hurting Australia's standing on the international stage. And as you are aware of this, because of our treatment of Australia's refugees and asylum seekers, many countries in the world, including some in our region, have actually called out Australia's poor treatment of refugees as an indication of our human rights standing. So the solution for this, of course, is one that is not only one timely for refugees and asylum seekers, but it is for the broader community. It is complex because we believe that permanent residency, which is an ideal outcome for, or at least an outcome that many of us probably advocating at the moment, is the end of their story. In fact, my view is that a permanent residency visa or permanent protection is still a limited outcome given that what happened to those who have been in permanent residency for the past 30 years. Salem has spoken about family separation for him and for others who have been on TPVs, but we also have permanent residents who have been in Australia since 2009, 10, and 8, who have not been able to bring their families, who have not been able to get their citizenship, who have had limited opportunities for family reunions. I would be happy to see people like Salem and people who are on SHEV visas and bridging visas to get permanent residency, but unless we change the whole regime that has been put in place, the deterrence regime or a strategy that the Australian government have put in 2013 in place, and it was toughened under successive government, the just giving permanent residency would not resolve this complex issue. Unless we recognize that it is part of a whole regime of policies, including the delays in the processing of family reunion, delays in the citizenship, it would not resolve issue. And so here, what I would like, and something that I've talked in my research, but also in some of my work with the government, is that there needs to be a recognition that people who have come by boat in Australia in the past 8 years, or even probably in the past 30 years, they have been the target of cruel policies that we have not seen with any asylum seeker in Australia, any refugees, whether they've come offshore or onshore. So there needs to be a recognition that this part of our policy has been discriminating, and the communities who have been subject to this, they actually feel being targeted. And as we know that as part of the social cohesion and the belonging in Australia, when the community or members of a community feel that they've been targeted, that's a sign of a society where it is hard to then build up resilience, it is hard to build social cohesion, and it is hard to build on community belonging or cultural understanding. So for those reasons, I believe that there needs to be more urgent work, and I hope that what the opportunity we have is really our next election. We need to start from now as refugee advocates, as community members, to speak up about this, make this an election issue. And when we go to the ballot box, we need to ensure that we, select or vote for a government that commits to resolving this issue, not just for TPV holders, but also for those permanent residency visas, but also for those who are in Nauru and Manus Island. I mean, part of this problem is that people who are in Nauru and Manus Island, some of them have been actually on the same boat with people who are in TPVs in Australia. I've been encouraged recently by the Australian people's generosity for community support program for those people who have gone from Nauru and Manus Island to Canada. I hope to see more of that kind of action unless we get those people and help them to resettle either in Australia or some other countries. That would then open opportunity for us to speak about this issue in Australia as a domestic issue. Now, in terms of the 3 solutions that I've said, we've been advocating for 3 things from the Hazara community since mid last year. One of the things that we have been advocating is that there is a slim chance through the SHEV visa for permanent residents, and we have heard from Salem, but also from Asha. And that is that if someone who completes the requirements of a SHEV visa, they are eligible to apply for a family stream visa or a skilled visa. Now, the family visa is, of course, a difficult one because, that requires someone to, of course, get married to someone in Australia, and, might not be possible for everyone. But in terms of the skilled visa, the requirement that we have at the moment is English language requirements at a high level, and that is, Salem spoke about that. But we also have a regime in our skilled visa that only recognize official certificate. What we've been telling to the government is that, is it possible to consider the lived experiences of people who have been in Australia for 8 years as an equivalent to an official diploma or certificate. Could that qualify as a condition for their skilled visa? And we know that people even who come on a skilled visa, even if they've got recognized official certificate, they would still have more problem than some of these refugees and asylum seekers who are now our community members, who have lived here for 8 years and who know, they've got their licenses, they've got their jobs, and they know how to work around. And they have been an integral part of some of our industries, both in regional towns and urban centers. The other thing that we've been advocating with the government was a regional scheme visa that Refugee Council advocated last year as part of the review of the regional work shortages in Australia. It was a parliamentary committee that was looking, and our community actually support that. As part of that, we talked with community members, TPVs and SHEV holders who were in urban centers. We talked with farmers, with other industries in regional towns, or whether they would be supportive of a similar regime. And overwhelmingly, our conversations with both community members and also business owners were that if there is a guaranteed visa at the end of this scheme, particularly after a year of work in regional area, the people who are on SHEV visas or TPVs, they would be willing to move to regional areas. Unless there is no that guarantee, then it's very hard to get people to move out of urban centers, especially the fact that we've got many challenges even for our citizens to move to regional areas. And in here, I highlight two examples of positive regional settlement in Australia in the past 2 decades. One is, of course, for the Afghan refugees who came here in before 2004, and they were settled in Shepparton and Mildura in Victoria, the two promising communities who have started their life and become part of these regional towns. And in recent years, probably since 2017-18, we've also seen successful resettlement of around 600 Yazidi families from Iraq and Syria in Armidale in New South Wales. Now, those are successful regional settlement of a group of people who've moved to regional areas. And I believe that looking at those, there are potential for SHEV visas, unless if the government consider that lived experience as a way to move forward. And of course, finally, as I said earlier, we are calling for the government that even though that we've got a regime that applies and treats all border arrivals in the same way, unfortunately, the countries that these people have come from are no longer the same. And some of these countries perhaps give an opportunity for us to advocate to government for some form of a special treatment. And that is true, for example, of Afghan refugees and asylum seekers whose country, particularly in the past 3 months, the prospect of peace is quite slim with the Taliban. The violence has increased rapidly. And as we speak through the month of May and June, every day between 170 to 200 people are killed in Afghanistan. And that is a recognition that Australian government decided to close its embassy. There are some talks that the Americans are now considering to close their embassy. And there are also, of course, a recognition by the Australian government and other Western countries to resettle interpreters and locally engaged staff. And in that context, we've been calling to the government to recognize that there needs to be some special, and our hope is that if this happens to one group, hopefully that paves the way for other people who have been on similar conditions. So I stop here and hopefully we'll explore some of these issues in question time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Those were some great pragmatic solutions as well, looking at some of the ways we can reform some of the policy while obviously opposing the policy outright as well. So thank you for those considered suggestions. Professor Marianne Kenny, I'd like to hand over to you as well to share some of the more legal policy solutions that you've consulted with different communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Asha. And I've just got a short PowerPoint to share. I'm really moved by following on from those words from Alireza and Salem about the real difficulties that the SHEV and TPV visas are going through, and also those that are on bridging visas, as you rightly acknowledge, Alireza. I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on the land of the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation, and pay my respects to them and their enduring and dynamic culture. And thanks to Asha for organising this session in particular. It's not easy to end a day that's been so full on, and been some fantastic speeches so far and discussion. And it's great to see that we're having this discussion about looking at possible solutions and to end the day on that note. I'm going to just talk through some particular proposals that have been worked on through a range of people. So these aren't mine particularly, so I want to make that disclaimer at the beginning, is that these are a result of discussions that we've had with a range of stakeholders, including, most importantly, those on these visas, and how these proposals are finalised and what is included and put to policymakers is an ongoing consultation. So I particularly welcome any contact and feedback. My contact details are at the end of this. Please feel free to contact me. These proposals are acknowledging some of the things that we've already heard about. I'm coming at it as if perhaps we don't have a change of government. If there is a change of government, I understand the Labor Party is committed to ending TPVs and SHEVs. I think that's another discussion to be had for another day as to how that is done, but I'm going to be focusing on what can we possibly do, what are the options for reform if we're working with this current government prior to the election and post the election if we continue with this coalition government. So I'm going to be talking about both the pathway and permanent residence as talked about, and there are difficulties and challenges, as Alireza has talked about, in terms of what does permanent residence mean. So I'm going to be discussing some of that as well. But I thought I'd just talk first briefly, just some of this probably many of you will know, and as I glance through all of the people that are watching on, I'm again overwhelmed by the lived experience and people who are working in this area. So some of this may be familiar to you. We know that the total caseload as at the end of the 30th of April is 31,142, of course growing as more children are born to families. At the moment, there are around 4,000 people still to be finalised. We do have a group of people that have been refused a TPV or SHEV, some over 8,000 people. That number may increase, and particularly as we come to process this group again, so when they get to the end of their visas, if they are going to be applying for TPVs or SHEVs again, we may see an increase in refusals. And I just want to acknowledge too that the fast track assessment process has been very flawed, and that's obviously for another discussion. And we need to do some work around the people that have been refused and are currently on bridging visas, and what happens with those people who continue to go through this process. Given the process started in 2015, and as Alireza mentioned, who would imagine we'd still have people still being processed by this time? But we are, while we're seeing some people finishing, we're going to be starting to see people already at the end of their first TPV or SHEV, while some people haven't even got a TPV or SHEV and are still being processed. But we're going to be seeing the next group of people increase rapidly, their visas expiring through this year and next year. So it really is a critical time to be having this discussion, if not already, around what will happen next. Just briefly about where people are living, I was sort of surprised when I tried to look at this to see that 35% of SHEV holders are currently living in a designated regional area. Now they're just living in those areas. It doesn't mean that they're working in that area, which is required for them to meet the pathway. Obviously, the majority of TPVs and SHEVs are living in New South Wales and in Victoria and are not necessarily living or working in a regional area. So I'm going to come and talk about that a little bit later. So in terms of the introduction of this visa, Asha already touched upon this at the beginning, so I'll just mention it briefly, but I do think we need to sort of look at what's the origins of this policy if we're going to try to work with the current government in terms of how can we amend it. So when introduced, now Prime Minister Morrison, who was the Immigration Minister at that time, the initial Liberal Party policy was that everybody would be on a temporary visa. This was different to the Howard era, where temporary visas would lead to a permanent protection visa. This government's been much harder and initially saying that nobody would be entitled to any permanency. But a window did open up through negotiations to get the legislation passed to allow people, some people, to be able to move on to permanent visas. So the sorts of language that we used at the time was that SHEVs would encourage enterprise through learning and earning. The Prime Minister said, or the Immigration Minister who was at the time, said it was a very high bar that people were going to clear. And we've heard from Salem about some of the difficulties that people are going to have in meeting the pathway. They were very clear that it would not result in permanent protection. So when we're talking about what possible options might there be, it's about trying to see if we can frame things so that we're talking about permanent visas not necessarily being permanent protection visas. So the policy intent we've already talked about was to provide an incentive for refugees to work and study in designated regional areas. And that's been difficult for those very reasons that Salem has talked about. By the time people were already granted visas, they were already established in communities and had jobs, had families, maybe children going to school, maybe themselves engaged in work. And those that do manage to meet this difficult pathway that we've talked about, for those that meet the pathway requirements, it's clear that relatively few will meet the current criteria for permanent skilled visas. So we've spoken about the age requirements, the skills assessments, and the English language requirements. So that means that the majority of people may have to reapply for a TPV or a SHEV and go through the process again, while many will be found to be refugees again. There may be some that may not be due to changes in country situation, and we know that, again, the processing system is quite flawed. That's going to be a significant administrative burden and cost to reprocess people, and obviously there is a huge amount of stress with the ongoing uncertainty for individuals and families that are affected by the policy. So what we're hearing from communities is that many people are working in the sorts of industries that Salem talked about. Many are actively engaged in studies, many are paying tax. So how can we use these sorts of factors to try to work toward making some reforms? And I think that COVID-19 in particular has highlighted the really vital contribution that migrant workers and refugees play in Australian society, particularly in frontline services, in trades and construction. And while many are working, as Salem has pointed out, we do need to acknowledge that not all are able to work due to health, age, caring responsibilities, or other factors like family violence. So we've been trying to think about trying to take some of these factors in talking to people in what policies we could come up for reform. So what we need is some less restrictive visa options for permanent residents, and a modification of the criteria around the pathway as well. Not forgetting the pathway, because you can't get to the permanent residence otherwise. So in looking at this, in 2004, the Howard government had similar challenges and did actually, while people were able to apply for permanent protection, there were some amendments made along the lines that Ali Reza has already talked about, where modifications were made to the regulations to allow for TPV holders to apply for a range of non-protection based visas. So modifying things like English language requirement or skill requirements. And those changes, at the time, the government said that it recognised that many TPV holders were making significant contributions to the community and had established links with Australia through work and social engagement. So moving on now to some of the options, I just want to acknowledge the options that Ali Reza's already talked about, and these are some other ones to think about. One of the issues is, do you look at each of the skill type visas and try to alter the various criteria, or could you go for something a little bit broader? So one option that a few people have talked about, and we've talked to people in the community about, is to try to create a particular stream for existing visas. There's a subclass 189 and a 191. So those visas actually have a stream that permits individuals to apply for permanent residence if they earn over a certain income for a particular number of years. And that income level is there, it's $53,900. So in a specific taxable income year. So that's a reasonable amount of money. And again, I recognise that not everybody will be able to meet that. If you've made this if you allowed for people on TPVs or SHEVs to apply for these visas, the advantage is that you don't then have to try to meet age requirements, skill thresholds, or English language requirements. That wouldn't be required. All you would have to do is demonstrate that you'd earned a specific income. So again, it's reflecting back to what we know about the community is that they are working, they are contributing and recognising that contribution. But obviously there are those who may not be able to meet that threshold income. So could we think about what exceptions we could make to that if people are studying, if they've lost income due to COVID, or they have an inability to work for ill health, age, or family violence. The other advantage of this sort of visa is that if a person were eligible for applying for it, you could include family members in that application. So you wouldn't have to wait to get this visa before you sponsored family members to come with you. You could make the application and have the family members included in that. So it addresses that issue of not having to wait for family members to come, which is a really good point that was made by Ali Reza. So the other option is it possible to create a new permanent visa? Picking up on some of those issues that Ali Reza talked about, could you, for example, create a new permanent visa which had a points test, which had specific criteria which recognise people's engagement and integration, that they've been here for 8 years, they've been engaged in employment and training, they may have certificates for that, have gone to TAFE. Could those be put together with education, community activities, volunteer activities and English language, and together create a sort of a profile for which you could then create a permanent visa. So this would then be able to be used as a positive way to recognise people's constructive participation in Australia. That's difficult because I don't think the government is very keen on creating new visas for people due to cost and various other issues. Another option, which is the dream option, which would be, could we just have a general amnesty? Could we just call for a general amnesty? The minister does have the power to grant a permanent visa to anyone and could lift a bar effectively and just grant everybody who is holding a TPV or SHEV something like a territorial asylum visa. This may be a useful option to use in particular, for example, if the Labor Party were to win, to sort of discuss what could be done for transitioning people onto permanent residence. So those are the permanent visa options. Another option, the other thing I wanted to mention was the amendments that we need to make to the pathway. So at the moment, it's only safe haven, people on safe haven enterprise visas that can apply for permanent visas if they meet the pathway. At the moment, if you're on a temporary protection visa, you don't have an option for applying for a permanent visa. You can only apply for another TPV or a SHEV. Would there be some way to enable people who are on temporary protection visas, if they meet particular criteria, that they too be able to apply for permanent protection as well? While we've said that maybe 35% of people who are on TPVs and SHEVs are living in regional areas, could we increase postcodes that are designated as regional? And some of you may be aware in WA, we've had a campaign ongoing for some time, and Perth as a regional area, and the WA government has actually approached the Commonwealth Government to ask that WA be included as regional for the purposes of the SHEV visa. Would it be possible, for example, for you that are living in other states, could you lobby your government to make a similar request to the federal government, so we can look to increase the areas designated as regionals? And if that's done, any work that's already been done to date in that particular area, if it was designated as a regional area, would count toward the pathway. Could you include volunteer work or voluntary work in the definition of work as another option in terms of recognising work done through the pathway? Are there options for people unable to work or study? So the government has recently said that if people have lost their jobs due to COVID-19, for example, that they could still meet the pathway even though they haven't been able to work or study. Could we expand that where there are people who have specific disabilities or health issues to recognise that they should be exempt? And we've also know that it has taken a very long time for some people to be able to have their cases looked at, and at the first stage, that they may have been here for 5 to 6 years or 8 years, but prior to even having their visa granted initially. If they had been working or studying, could that work or study be included as well in terms of trying to meet the pathway? So those are my contacts really quickly. I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A session and to receive any feedback otherwise from people about some of those proposals. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I'm going to move to some Q&A time. So if you have further questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But I am going to take my prerogative as host to ask the first question. And I think Marianne premised this question pretty well when you're talking about the differences between the policy of the Labor opposition and the current government. And I think you're right that we need to consider options with the current government who are the ones in power at the moment. And we're unlikely to know the outcome. We don't know the outcome of an election. And we very well may well have this government for another 3 years as well. So considering working with the government we have, what are some of the political levers or imperatives to try convince this government to reform the policy? Put another way, what are the incentives for this government to try and reform the policy? What's in it for them, and how can we try to find some of those levers and use those in our advocacy?
I think, a key word that Ali Reza was talking about quite a bit, I noticed you use quite a lot, is a favourite word of Minister Hawke, which is social cohesion. I think that that's an important point that you raised. He talks a lot about social cohesion, and I heard him talk at a conference, in fact, about the fact, for example, that there were people in Australia who are applying for partner visas and having very long waits, and people being in a position of uncertainty was a threat to social cohesion. And I thought, well, 2 years waiting for a partner visa is nothing compared to what people have been, how long people have been waiting on TPVs and SHEVs. So social cohesion is a really important one. I think there are opportunities post-COVID, given that we don't have people coming in, for them to step back and say, this is a time, this provides an opportunity for us to review our policy. It is consistent with their policy, as I talked about, that they are trying to reward earning and learning. how can we talk about the economic benefits that people on TPVs and SHEVs have been bringing, and that to try to move them onto permanent residence may bring positive changes. So, for example, if you're on a temporary visa, you can't get a loan to promote your to continue to grow your business. You can't purchase property. These are things that are barriers for people on temporary visas to properly contribute to Australia's economic recovery.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Salem or Ali, did you have anything to add to that?
I think not really, just to add one point. Yeah, I mean, the economic argument is really what the government are really looking for. They don't care about the humanity and stuff. So as long as you talk money, that would probably be attractive. So yeah, the economic argument, there is an economic argument to be made now, especially with the current situation. And particularly in the Western Australian government, we have a shortage of people working in the construction sector. So, and all of the people, especially in my community, they are already there and they are really successful in their businesses. They're working there. Now, I don't see why the government is not accepting them as to be working as a skilled worker while they have been working for the last 7 or 5 years. And also the remittance, the amount of money that these people save and send overseas for the families, because they don't have their families in here. So you just imagine if every one of them get the chance to bring their families in here, why should they not spend that money in the Australian community instead of sending them overseas? And Marianne raised a good point of buying a houses. I've got a lot of friends who want to buy a house. They have saved some money, but the precarity does not allow them to buy a house, or they do not have the confidence to invest in here. So that's why they usually prefer to send them overseas to invest in some sort of businesses that they have in mind. So it is really important for the government to take this into consideration, that there's a good chunk of people who make money, who contribute to the economy, and they are productive and they are entrepreneurial. So why not take the chance?
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience regarding the government's concern about boat arrivals. Now, obviously, the policy of TPVs and subsequently SHEVs was introduced as part of Operation Sovereign Borders. It's often referred to as a third pillar of Operation Sovereign Borders, as a deterrent policy. How do we address the arguments from the government that reforming the current policy or giving people a permanent visa will encourage more boat arrivals?
Do you want me to answer, or Marianne? I think it's legal things. I would prefer Marianne, but I can say something, but I would prefer to hear from
Marianne,
Lawyer.
do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, look, I think that was some interesting stuff that arose recently around trying to show any form of humanity toward the Billawheeler family. That particular stick was brought out, and I think that there appears to be plenty of evidence that there hasn't been any boats arriving, and that the key pillar that stopped boat arrivals has been the interception and turnbacks, sending people to Nauru and Manus. Putting people onto TPVs and SHEVs didn't stop boats previously, and it's not now. So I think I don't think that those arguments are valid. So I think it's about, and again, for people on Nauru and Manus, they are offering them a permanent solution, not in Australia, obviously, in other countries. And people have been leaving to go to the United States, and it hasn't caused a flood of arrivals to Australia, nor has bringing people back for medical treatment caused a flood of arrivals to Australia.
Yeah, And if I may add to Marianne's point, and I think it's also the fact that similar policies in 2004 as well. I think when the government decided to grant permanent residency, the boat didn't stop immediately. What I think was changed was, in fact, the number of refugees who, or the nature of conflict in some of those countries actually changed, rather than to the fact to say that because Australian government actually gave permanent residency to a group of people in 2003 and 4, that actually encouraged the boat arrival. And the second thing is also the fact that people who this notion of, I think, boat arrival with this permanent residency is that there have been increasing improvement in government's capacity and of course governance of the return of boats. We have seen that many occasions when initially this policy was introduced. And I think that increased capacity and working with regional countries, particularly in Asia, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries, I think have given us assurances that the boat arrival would not start even if these people who are in Australia would be given permanent residency. But this has one element to it, and that is that a significant part of this policy then depends, if there would be a change of policy in government, whether a whole amnesty or other regimes that we've talked, it depends on what would happen to people who have remained now in Manus Island and Nauru. I think if no one would be brought back from Nauru and Manus Island as part of this, then I think people who would be given a permanent residency in Australia, that would, very unlikely to result in any boat arrivals.
Thank you, Ali. The precedent of John Howard and his government giving permanent visas to TPV holders is, I think, a very good one to refer to. It's obviously the same coalition government and very similar example of times. And if Howard can do it, then why can't Morrison do it today? So on that, there's a similar question from the audience about what do you as panelists think about offering people, putting a time limit basically on temporary protection, so that after a certain amount of time, for example, 8 to 10 years in Australia, people will be eligible for a permanent protection visa, or perhaps using the unfilled places in the refugee and humanitarian program because of the slowdown due to COVID, to grant permanent visas to temporary visa holders. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
I think, well, to me, I mean, it's as long, to me, it's more of the government willingness to solve the issue. I mean, if the government is trying, when there was John Howard, I think there was a push and also a willingness from the government that they have finally admitted. What I see currently is more of a sort of a deliberate and a sort of discriminatory toward a certain group of people that they do not consider them as sort of these useful or equal citizens, something, because give you an example, for example, a living example. We have asked from federal government to include Perth as a SHEV region 2.5 years ago now. And it is up to the state government that they have to apply from the federals. And if the state government won, there's a legal framework that the federal government has to abide by that. But we haven't had that we haven't heard anything back from the government. While the government have included all of Perth as a regional with the purpose of skilled migration visa, and they have only excluded one visa, which is the SHEV visa. So you just see that there's not willingness from the government to solve the issue. Otherwise, there's a lot of possibility that we can solve it without any sort of like making headlines or making a lot of buzz here and there. There's a possibility, there's a framework, the work can be done, but the willingness is not in the government. It is so sad, you know, that the policies of a broader policy of the government is somehow, it's my personal belief that I feel that it's indicating a certain belief that the person who makes the policy, that they have a certain views on a certain group of people, and that's why they make policies based on that. That's what I'm hearing. So as long as we are not having a strong backbench to push that, we cannot make that happen.
Thank you, Salem. I've got time for one final question, which is about family reunion. Now, obviously, one of the main concerns for the group here on SHEVs and TPV is about access to family reunion. And even when we're doing consultations, people say, I don't care as much about a permanent visa. What I want is my family here. So perhaps a question first for Marianne, but also for Alireza and Salem. Are there ways that the current legislation and policy and regulations could be reformed to allow family reunion for SHEV and TPV holders without, without granting them a permanent visa first? Can we do something sooner and quicker to give them access to family reunion?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I think obviously the way the law works now is you have to have a permanent visa in order to be able to sponsor a family member here. So that's why in trying to come up with options, trying to think of ways of moving on to a permanent visa that allows you to apply for permanency at the very same time, like other visa holders do when they apply for that particular skilled visa that I talked about. It would allow you to include family members in the application, even if they're overseas. They don't have to be present in Australia. So that provides, I think, is one reason why that option, in talking and taking that option around to people has been one that people are thinking about, because otherwise you are trapped in the same situation as Alireza talked about, because even if you have permanent residence, the way that if you're applying for a partner visa and so on, the difficulty is that you're put at the bottom of the list in terms of priorities if you came by boat.
And in addition to Marianne's point, if I may make, is I think what we've got at the moment is that there seems to be an unwritten condition that if people get their citizenship, then that would speed up their family reunion visa. My suggestion is that we need to call for the government to give priority for assessing the citizenship of people who have got permanent residency and have come by boat. Now, when we have been speaking with the government about this, the department's line or the government line is that we've got so many applications for citizenship, thousands of, and in 1 year, I think, they were told us that, about 200,000 applications were waiting to be processed. So, but there needs to be a call for priority here. And the reason for priority is that those number of citizenship application in the department, most of them are from migrants and asylum seeking refugees who have got their permanent residency on shore. And for them, it doesn't matter whether they got a citizenship or not. Once you arrive by air, once you got your permanent residency, whether you come as asylum seeker or as a migrant, you would then be able to reunite with your family without any problem. You would be eligible for, accessing the education and all that. The question is that for people who've come by boat, their citizenship have been, their family reunion have been attached to their citizenship application. So I think what needs to be moved forward is the speeding of the processing of the citizenship applications and giving them priority. I think that would then allow for these families to, quickly reunite with their loved ones.
Thank you, Alireza, and thank you to all three of you for your very insightful recommendations and discussion about finding solutions for refugees on temporary visas. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the audience as well. I am going to hand back to our MC Queen G to wrap up today and tell us about tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asha, and to all the panelists throughout the day today. It's been very engaging and informative sessions, and I myself have come away with new knowledge. We hope that today has left you all with something to think about, and I hope that you can join us tomorrow or tell people to join us. Tomorrow's conference will start from 10 a.m. and we're looking forward to continuing the conversations and having a great evening. And I'll be excited to let you know that we'll be ending tomorrow's conference with a performance from myself. So I've got a special performance that's been inspired by the conversations that have been had here. I'd also now like to announce the winners of the cookbook, and just before I do that, I would like to remind you all the feedback is really important for these sessions. For the Refugee Council of Australia, we've been hosting this conference for you, so you can find that link through the Humanities Virtual Hub on the screen, and just the feedback will take a couple of minutes or less than 2 minutes, and you go in the draw to win a Share a Meal, Share a Story cookbook. We do have the winners from today's session, today, so thank you for providing your feedback. The first recipients of the hard copy of this book is Olivia from the Inner West Council, Karen from Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, and Rob from Uniting Australia. So congratulations to you all, and I hope you cook some fabulous meals from the cookbook. I'll see you all online tomorrow at 10 a.m. for more sessions. And thanks again to everybody. Yeah, have a good one. Take care.